Thanks everyone for joining this morning. I'm Joe. I'm one of the co-founders of Robin. The focus of this session isn't Robin, but if you haven't heard of Robin, we automatically check school websites for compliance and audit the policies on those school websites using AI. And we've been sort of offering Robin for the last year or so. We've got nearly 2,000 schools and 150 trusts using Robin now, which is amazing. But that also means we've spent 2 years talking to trusts about evolving and maturing their operations as well as growing in size. Everything from digital strategy to governance to kind of succession planning. And that's been really interesting, kind of learning and thinking about what's changing in the way trusts operate. And we wanted to bring together a mix of people experiences to explore how to make growth a positive experience when scaling or changing the way you kind of operate in terms of people, systems, and culture. So I'm really looking forward to this call. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, and there is a Q&A option in Zoom as well as the chat. If you have any questions that you'd like to go to the panel kind of properly at the end of the session, please do use the Q&A option, and then you can upvote if you see one you'd like us to answer, and we'll make sure we've got some time at the end. And I'll just quickly introduce our panel. So we've got Luke, Sam, and Matt on the call. Luke is Digital Strategy Lead at King's Group Academies, which is 15 schools across Berkshire, Hampshire, and Sussex. Luke was at a 5-school trust which merged into King's Group in May 2024. Samira is Director of Trust Governance at CST, the Confederation of School Trusts. Previously to this, Sam worked at 2 large trusts, first ARC and then Lift, or it was AET, I guess, at the point Sam was there.
Yeah.
And where she led governance across the schools there. And Matt is CEO or trust leader at Embark Federation based in Derby. Embark has grown from a 2-school federation in 2017 to now a 23-school trust with plenty of interest from more schools to join them there. We're going to do a couple of polls as we go through the session. We're going to pop the first one up now. We've got a group of people here from across trusts around the country. We thought it'd be really interesting to know what your priorities are. This might be because you're growing. It might just be because you're developing. Don't overthink it. We're just interested in which area of your trust is a priority or the highest priority for change and improvement at the moment. If you pick one, we'll sort of pop those results up. If you think of another one that we haven't put there, please do stick it in the chat. That would be useful for us to hear. And while you're filling in those, let's get a sort of proper hello from the group. And I was wondering, maybe I could ask each of you what's on your to-do list this week. It'd be interesting to hear, like out in the world, out in your roles, what are you working on? Maybe we can start with Matt.
Yeah, morning, Joe, and morning, everyone. It's lovely to be with you all this morning. Like every week, it's really varied. We're kind of never bored in this role, and it's been an interesting week actually in terms of a to-do list. We've had a really good session with Derbyshire Council talking about SEND and AP, which was certainly very interesting. Also talking about conversions because we've got 6 schools on board at the minute, so that's been of interest. School visits, which are always the highlight of the job. And then to finish tomorrow, we've got a concert where our Embark choir are singing a Christmas concert, and they're performing alongside 6 West End stars. So a nice way to finish the week tomorrow evening. The likes of Laura Pick, who was Elphaba in Wicked and stuff like that. So a lovely way to finish the week tomorrow night. So a varied week and an exciting week as always.
It's all happening at Embark. Samira?
So we are publishing a new paper in spring called Redesigning Your Governance Community. So I've been working on that paper. Next week, I'm training up some CEOs on governance, a couple of days, a couple of cohorts. And so I'm prepping for that in Manchester. We're going to be. And then in spring, we also have a new masterclass called Establishing Next Gen Governance. And so I'm in the process of putting that course together and kind of thinking about what it's going to look like. So that's kind of me this week.
Amazing. How about you, Luke? What's on your
Yeah, well, at the moment we're going towards the end of term, so it's all about data. Whether it's still building and visualizing the previous data to compare to the new data coming in, or making sure that we streamline data coming out of our MIS to make sure that we minimize the workload on people, but also make sure we hit those deadlines at the end of half term. So supporting all the data leads there, and then planning for next summer, and really these things ramp up really quickly. So we've got huge works going on and huge things planned. And so to make sure that everything goes smoothly, we're in that process of making sure that we're planning everything so it happens seamlessly, hopefully, so no one notices it all happening. So at the moment, really, it is that phase of guessing ahead, keeping an eye on all the contracts and things like that, and just tying things up before Christmas so we can come back in the new year and hit the ground running.
brilliant, really interesting? And I can see the polls come back actually like really varied, which is interesting. Lots,
Yeah.
there's almost equally split across the things that we thought that people might be working on. There's obviously so much involved in leading a trust. It'd be interesting in the chat, those joining, if you wanted to say hello and sort of where you're joining from, just that'd be nice to hear as well. Let's get into the conversation. Samira, if we could start with you. You've worked at and with multiple large trusts, and I just wonder what you've seen, what you've learned in terms of what works and what doesn't work when you're thinking about how a central team operates.
Um, yeah, so I think it would start by not calling it a central team. I would call it shared services. I would call it anything other than the word central seems to kind of make it kind of conveys a certain image. So yeah, I think what I've noticed is that we sometimes get away from the purpose of trusts, right? What is the purpose of trusts? We're here to act as a protective structure, right, for our schools. We're here to act as strategic enablers, but we're also here to act as anchor institutions in our communities. And what does that mean? We want to reduce friction for our schools, taking on those admin and kind of operational burdens and freeing up school leader time. We want to amplify expertise, providing it really kind of rapid access to high quality functions. And then we want to use resources nimbly and responsively, putting them sort of knowledge and funding and capacity in the places in the trust where they're going to have the biggest impact. Ultimately, what we want to do is create conditions for schools to thrive, right? So it's about striking that balance between consistency and contextualization. And Joe, when we were planning for this, I told you I was going to use a tennis analogy. You need consistency, right? Because consistency is the foundation of improvement and performance, isn't it? You've got a good tennis player, you've got a great tennis player. What's the difference between them? The great tennis player is consistent. And so we want consistency, but too much consistency creates cookie cutter schools, right? It undercuts innovation and sort of local knowledge, local expertise, that kind of responsiveness you need to the community. Contextualization is really important, right? Because it unlocks an energy and innovation and kind of, like I said, responsiveness at the local level. But without consistency, that can lead to a lack of quality, that can lead to kind of fragmentation of the trust, right? Not everybody pulling the same direction, duplication. For example, in the governance context, and have I jumped to the wrong question for you, Joe, or am I answering the right
No, no,
question?
crack
Okay,
on. Yeah,
good.
yeah.
In the governance context, what we wanted to do always was take care of those compliance tasks, right? The things that don't need context, the things that are automated and repeatable and repetitive tasks, anything that's administrative and operational that we can take off their hands. So but at the same time, as we were doing that, we want to provide expertise and resources to enable good governance to create that consistently good practice. So what that means is using tools like Robin, right, to take care of policies and website, the amount of time schools would waste on website compliance, right? When really that's just something we should be taking off them. And then that frees them up to spend their energy and time on things locally that really matter. And the thing I would say is what I've seen at scale, the thing that happens is leaders often aren't able to let go. And what you need to do at scales, you do need to let go. You need to empower more decision makers within your trust. You need to flatten structures a bit. And the reason I say that is because if a trust stays hierarchical, and I have seen this happen, where you need, 17 layers of approval for every single decision. You've not reduced friction, you've increased friction for schools, right? And so if a school leader, for example, let's take the HR recruitment example, if they're looking for the recruitment team centrally to help them recruit a teacher, but it takes so many layers of approval and so many processes that they then lose good candidates in the meantime, you're not serving your schools. So I think it is really important to think about how, as trusts, we mature our systems so that we move away from these hierarchical structures toward a more distributed leadership model, if you will. And Dixon's comes to mind. I spoke to you, Joe, about this when we were talking previously. They have a circles model. And so what they do is they empower these small teams that are focused on very specific things, curriculum, attendance, whatever it is. And those teams are made up of people, experts with knowledge from every part of the trust who might be able to speak to that issue. And then they are empowered to make decisions without having to go up the chain and constantly get layers of approval. And so for me, that works because you're cutting out the gatekeeping, the bureaucracy, the fluff load is what I tend to call it. But it does require really high levels of trust, really strong relationships, making sure you're kind of culturally aligned and values aligned, and making sure everyone's kind of pulling in the same direction. But I think if trusts are going to scale, they have to be comfortable with this. Because the worst thing you can do is actually continue to have that kind of really hierarchical structure that requires way too much process. And then you're not fulfilling the purpose of a trust when you do that. And I think, can I add one more thing? It's not one and done. I think people think, okay, we set up a structure, we set up an operating model, and that's it, done. Actually, it's an organic thing, an organization. It changes, it morphs. And so you need to constantly be thinking about what. So, for example, with Dixon's, they rethink the circles all the time. Maybe we don't need a circle around curriculum now. We actually might need a circle around something else. And I love that. It's agile, it moves. But really importantly, it's the right people making right decisions with the right information at the right time in a very rapid, kind of agile way. That's the strength, I think, of a trust. I hope I've answered your question.
No, that's really interesting. We could probably just crack on talking. We'll maybe move around with the questions we've planned, but I think if we can keep some of those threads going, like that question of like hierarchy and friction feels really interesting, kind of practically as well. Um, Maybe we could come to you, Matt, because you've been having this experience of growing and
Yes.
thinking about sort of structure. How do you decide whether it's appropriate to bring more schools into the trust, and how do you think about how the trust changes as that happens?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and I think for us, we set out quite early on some growth principles as a trust, and I think that's really helped. The trust board, very simple. Nothing fancy about them, but I think because we started in 2019, we came into we were able to learn from others, I suppose, that had come before us, and one of the things we said is that trusts that had failed in the past had maybe not got their capacity right. So we said we want at least 3-to-1 good or better schools to those that require improvement. So I think that was one thing, and I think not just Ofsted judgments, but also our own judgments. Because some of the Ofsted grades were kind of quite out of date for some of the schools. So I think we were 3-to-1 at the time when we set up as a trust, and now we've got 25 schools. Two just joined us this last week, but we're now over a 10-to-1 ratio. So in terms of our capacity, we're able to judge our capacity, and that's been really important to us. I think another thing that was set out by the trustees, and this was right back in 2019, was regionally, I think they were keen in terms of that geographical considerations. I think they wanted us to kind of really focus on Derbyshire. So when we have had interest from schools outside of the county, we've been able to say no quite quickly to those. And I was saying to you last week, Joe, that interestingly we've had 83 schools approach us over an 18-month period. So it's quite significant in terms of that. But for the majority of those schools who are outside of Derbyshire, we were able to just say, I'm really sorry, but we're not the right trust for you at this point. But also, I think, we make most of our judgments on a values based as well. So our values are family, integrity, teamwork, and success. And we've always said, we're not about big egos at Embark. We want the right people around the table. And if one of our values is teamwork, and we want people to be able to share and kind of willing to really work together as a team, a couple of bad apples and that could really, ruin the essence of the trust. So we've turned schools away on that basis as well. Had teachers had a massive ego and kind of like we're thinking, well, they're just not going to fit. They're not going to, we can't imagine them sat around our table. And I've had head teachers in the past who said, I'll bring the school into the trust, but I'm looking for a job on the central team. And I'm saying, well, if one of our values is integrity, doing the right thing when no one's watching, and you're kind of not showing that at all. So I think those ground rules, the growth principles, those things that we set out at the very beginning of the journey, I suppose, of Embark 2019, they proved to be really useful, and they're not difficult. They're very simple, but they've helped guide us through the last, what would be 7 years in January. So they've helped us guide us through those years, really.
It's interesting, and it's interesting how much that's obviously appealing to the schools outside of the trust who are seeing that as well. If they're looking at that and thinking, "Oh, that seems like a kind of interesting and a trust we'd like to be a part of."
And one of the principles we set out was that we'd never approach a school. So we said, we're not going to be one of those trusts who is saying, "Come and join our trust." We said we'll focus on the schools that we've got. And if we're doing the right thing and if we're doing well by those schools, then that will either pique people's interest or it won't. And we'll, which is an interesting principle around growth, that we're not going to go out seeking growth. We're going to do right by the schools that are in the trust. And I think, like I say, that's the amount of interest that's come off the back of that, has taken us by surprise, really. But I think it's, you do the right things by the schools and the communities, and usually, like you said, that piques people's interest, and they're intrigued and pick the phone up to us. So, and not just in Derbyshire, but from around the country. We've had a 7-school trust in Kent and 9 schools in Leicester, schools in Loughborough, Stoke, Cheshire, all around the country. But I think, like I say, we've been able to stick by those growth principles, and it's kind of stood us in good stead, really.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's come across to Luke. Luke, one thing we've sort of seen that lots of trusts are working on in the context of everything else that's happening anyway, but also how the trust is evolving, is obviously digital strategy. At the same time, that can feel quite abstract. I've been to quite a few talks about digital strategy where I think, what are you actually doing? And so what are some specific things you've done or decided not to do that you think have kind of had a positive impact in terms of the way King's Group are going about digital strategy and the work you do in your role?
Yeah, well, I think digital strategy can cover huge areas, and it's quite easy to also look to other trusts and assume that other trusts are doing things better. But our mantra typically is keeping things simple. Ultimately, we want IT just to work, and so there's some things we do, but largely we focus on consistency. So we're lucky we're a Google trust. I think if we're a Microsoft trust, I'll be saying exactly the same thing. Having the same platforms just makes sense, and streamlining what you're doing makes a huge difference. And so with our digital strategy, we focus in the background on the infrastructure and just making sure that the things in the background just work. And we've got a good IT team that focus on that. And that's largely the unseen bit, often the bit that costs the money, that in some ways appears that you're slowing down the progress. So when you're looking at a digital strategy, you're actually planning ahead for where you want to get to. And our digital strategy, we've essentially been running probably ongoing for about 8 years now. And the focus has been the same, that IT should just work. We want children to walk into classrooms, be able to use a device and be online without thinking about it. Typically that does, but that's come through ongoing simple planning in terms of infrastructure, making sure internet, wireless, everything is in place, and all those things are in place that the IT team take care of. And that then enables everything else just to happen because at the heart of what we do, it's all about teaching and learning. And ours is very much driven by the classroom. So, what do we want to happen in the classroom? And it's not about going out and grabbing the latest tools and gadgets. We actually do an awful lot with AI, with different tools. But what we tend to do is choose the right platforms. So working with Google makes a big difference. Working with things like Canva makes a big difference. Joe, obviously, we work with Robin. So we choose these tools, but then when we're using these tools, we roll them out across the trust, but by getting buy-in from people, by saying, actually, by using these tools, this is what you can do, and we showcase what you can do, and we get people wanting the tools. So that way it keeps it really simple. And so if you look at our trust, you wouldn't see people changing things all the time. It's actually a natural evolution of tools coming in. And then we make use of them. So, for example, we've got a standardized MIS across the trust. 12 months ago, we didn't have that. We move at pace when we need to move at pace. But actually, by everyone having a standard MIS, that allows us then to make use of that by doing things like training and using live data. And picking up on what Samira was saying, essentially we work very much on a flat structure. I work on digital strategy with a data team. My data team is the data managers in the schools, and the work I do supports them by bringing them together and sharing good practice. So when we asked earlier about the central team, actually I'm just a conduit that brings those people together into meetings and say, actually, we're all doing the same thing. And so we set things up the same way. And I could go and I could name James and other people in our trust and say, actually, out of this process, I've discovered real expertise. And I mean, for example, Nicola's constantly sharing within it. And she's almost a central team member, but she's based in the school. She does the job, so she knows the challenges. So when people are asking her questions, it's not a remote person doing it. Actually, they're our team together. And I'm really lucky to be that conduit that essentially moves between it and always magpies different ideas, brings people together. So in terms of our structure, we're at an interesting size where we're slightly smaller than Math and Samira's at the moment. So I'm able to get into lots of those different schools, and it does evolve. But I think that flat structure you talked about earlier really works. And the digital strategy needs to be those systems in place to make sure the collaboration can just happen. And so I mean, it's challenging. We merged together. We were really lucky that we had actually three different groups all on Google. Had we had a challenge where it was a different system, we'd had to deal with that. We've dealt with about MIS and we brought them onto the same MIS. This summer, we've got a challenge of bringing together tenancies. And if you haven't looked at tenancy migration, it's when you've got three different Google groups in different areas, which has a whole host of unseen challenges that detracts from this keep it simple, it should just work, to suddenly you discover things don't work. And then all the background work has to take place. And that's some of the planning that we're doing at the moment to make sure next summer we bring it all together. And it's a huge job. The IT team will take care of it. Students and teachers hopefully will see very little of all the work that's gone into it because we'll make sure that everything's in place. So come September, for most people, it appears to just work as it did before. But the unseen bit is actually collaboration will suddenly improve and things will just keep getting better. So those tools we've got will just keep improving, making things simpler and simpler. So when you're doing things in the classroom, it just works. When teachers want to innovate, they can just do it. And that's largely our approach. So I think digital strategy can sound, you're right, quite abstract, but actually simplifying it is our main aim.
You do the hard work to make it simple, like they say.
Absolutely.
We should come back to that. We're going to do a second poll, just as we keep talking, around this question of like how much trusts are going to grow. So the average size of a trust now is 8 schools. And we know kind of politically and also just like pragmatically, that's something that's changing. So we were wondering what you think, sort of in 10 years' time. Yeah, it's very hard, finger in the air. What do you think the average size of a trust will be? While that's coming in, I will maybe come back to you. It's interesting, there's a theme you were both talking about, which is all three of you were talking about, which is about kind of consistency and the kind of central functions that just work and removing that fluff load. like at the same time, that could make trust level work sound a bit sort of cold, a bit sort of generic. Whereas I'm sure like these are really purpose-driven organizations as well. I don't know, Samira, maybe what's your take on that kind of balance between having a trust that really just has the basics right, but also having as you said, having purpose and personality, and how that works when you're not the schools.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's the beauty of a trust is that you're bringing together the expertise, right, and the structures and systems of a trust together with the local identity and expertise at the local level that really understand the community and is able to contextualize that trust strategy. So for me, it's that kind of combination that actually works so beautifully. And I think inherently a trust enables collaboration, doesn't it? And so it's just you're in a legal structure. You're in a single accountability and legal structure. And that just supercharges collaboration because it's no longer dating, it's actually marriage. Right? You can't just pull out and leave. It's that real deep commitment. And yeah, and you're all kind of you have that shared purpose, that shared vision. I think a big part of this, I keep calling it central team. I like to call it shared services, is is like Luke said, is you are that conduit for enabling the collaboration and the shared practice, right? So you're acting as that bridge between the schools in terms of putting them together, bringing them all together, and then elevating the best ideas. And that's how we supercharge school improvements. Actually, it's that idea of collective intelligence. As humans, I always talk about this. We have succeeded as humans because of our collective intelligence and our ability to disagree well, actually, and have different ideas that clash with each other, and the best one rises to the surface. That's what's beautiful about trusts, is they are inherently about collective intelligence. But for that to happen, you do need a bit of orchestration, right? And that's what that shared services can do. It can orchestrate the collective intelligence of the trust. I don't know if I answered your question at all. By the way, can I make one really quick point about the poll? I think to talk about schools is problematic in some ways because you might have 8 small primaries, right? Uh, and or you might have 8 large secondaries. Those are 2 very different trusts.
Mm.
Pupil numbers actually in some ways are a better measure of where we think we're going to be going, because to get that trust dividend, you do need a certain number of pupils, I think. You have to get that kind of Goldilocks zone of like the right amount of pupils and funding per pupil to finally start getting the benefits. I don't know if Luke and Matt, if you agree with me, but it kind of almost comes down to pupil numbers
I
more than
might bring,
schools.
it's really interesting. I might bring in Matt because I know you've had secondaries join,
Yes.
um, which brings pupils, right?
Yeah, so we had 4 secondaries join us at once. So we started as a primary trust, um, and we had 4 secondaries join, which brought us around 4,000 pupils, and our trust doubled overnight. So that was definitely a big shift. I agree with Samira. It's definitely pupil numbers and not. I think we had 1,600 pupils when we started as a 7 primary school trust, and then, like I say, 4 secondaries joining. We kind of went from 4,000 pupils at the time across around 15 primaries to 8,000 pupils. And those 4 secondary schools doubled the numbers overnight. But interestingly, I think and I agree with Samira, it's about, we're in service to the schools. And adding on to the structure, in terms of the central structure, what we needed shifted. It really changed overnight, and we needed a full-time safeguarding lead, for example, because of I suppose the number of the volume of issues that were coming in from the secondary schools. So it's been able to adapt, I suppose, the central like I say, the central structure. I agree around shared services, really, rather than, but adapting as to the needs of the school, really. So we work really closely with Sadeghi Carter, and we've been really lucky to do that. And always talking to us about the trust dividend, and I think, like I say, it's being able to be in service to those schools, and what are the benefits from being part of the trust, and being able to articulate that as well, I think is really important.
But to go back to the point of schools versus pupil numbers, adding schools is adding separate organizations, if you will, within the organization. So there is something about the number of schools as well, because it adds to the complexity of what you're doing. You're serving different communities. So while the pupil numbers might be tiny, you're still serving a totally different community in a totally different school. So both are kind of important in some ways, but yeah.
On the map, also the people side of it, of course, these schools are full of the people, student, staff, leaders. How have you found that experience? Kind of what have you learned about leading people across a trust as it changes and grows?
So I think as you grow, and I think there's a question in the Q&A box as well, which kind of partly answer that, I think, with this one. So I think it's still important to be as visible as as possible. So for us, I like to get round our schools at least once a term. Coming up to the Christmas period, I think I've got about 20 nativities booked in across the over the next few weeks. So I'll certainly be ready for Christmas, and in the Christmas spirit by the time that finishes. So, but I think we book in, we schedule in those visits to the school, and as part of that, I think what the question in the Q&A says, how often do you visit schools? How do you know they feel part of Embark? And we do your traditional surveys, of course, where we kind of get feedback from the schools, but I kind of do almost an unofficial survey as well, where you visit the schools, the head teacher, kind of opportunity to meet staff and see the pupils, etc. But also it's a chance to just say to the head teacher, look, tell me the things we're doing well, because it's nice to hear those, but also tell the even better if, how can Embark improve? What are the bits that we can change about the trust to make us better? And a simple example of that, a number of our head teachers said last year, they said everyone who are doing their central services for the trust, you've surrounded yourself, got great people, they're all doing a brilliant job. But as a head, sometimes, you've got emails coming in, whether it's safeguarding, HR, all the, school improvement, all those different things. If they all land at once, it can be a bit overwhelming for a head teacher. So they're saying, what can you do around that? So now we have one weekly communication and newsletter that comes centrally, and that might save some weeks. It might save 14 different emails, and they kind of know where to look. So I think your communication, the consistency, all of that has got to be clearer. And I think the other side of it as well is you've got to be able to delegate well, as a larger trust, and I think the consistency of approach from the team, I think that's really important. So, I mean, I'm lucky; I've got incredible people, who are working for Embark, but I'm very happy to kind of delegate and share, let them work the magic, really. So, I think that's important.
Yeah, that's great. And I wonder, Luke, in some ways, Luke, you were sort of a person experiencing a merger on the sort of people side of it. I wonder what you sort of learned, what your experience was of bringing people and systems together through that, specifically through a merger.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating when you bring we talked about numbers. I went from a school, a trust that had a large school with 2,200 students down to a school with 50. And so when you're talking, but interestingly, within that trust, it was very much working collaboratively as one unit. And so we had 5 schools geographically very, very tight. And so you had head teachers working very closely. And I think this is what, I pick up that the marriage analogy is really interesting, because previously you have schools locally, head teachers will meet, but you don't really have collaboration. You wouldn't have, a Google tenancy between local schools that weren't properly linked together. You wouldn't have that collaboration. we had that collaboration, and we had literally head teachers working together. The executive team were head teachers in themselves, and so they were sort of there running the trust, which meant all SLTs worked together, shared curriculums, and all these things going on. And then when you merge with a different trust, then it's a big cultural shift because you know what you're doing, and you then got to bring together a different culture. And in our merge, it was more in autonomous, independent schools doing slightly different things, a totally different culture. And so actually going, well, let's bring together the best of both bits that work. You learn your lessons where actually too much interconnectedness actually can create some issues. I mean, you've got too many things going on. You learn those lessons, but also I think we've learned that actually schools working in silos is really hard. Whether it's a trust, whether it's a single academy, it's really hard to actually work as a silo. And so whatever we do, we work on making sure that we're developing collaboration within the trust and working in ways of making sure that we take the best from the cultures in all the schools and maintaining that. But actually, a real focus on that collaboration side and bringing down system barriers because ultimately, the people want to work together. People want to share experiences, share expertise. And bizarrely, we end up with systems barriers in the way, whether the systems are technology or people or closed doors. And so I spend the whole time working on actually going, let's just share. And if I see a good idea, we'll make sure that person shares that idea and takes credit for it. And so for me, it's no different in some ways to this community we've got here going on. I'm here to share what we do to bring ideas together as educators because we're in a luxurious situation where actually me sharing what we do comes at no cost, and me learning from other people actually only brings benefit. And so opportunities like this to share, I feel, is part of what we do as educators, what we do in this space. And that's the culture that we develop within our trust.
It's
So
interesting.
I feel like I've got a little bit of a tangent.
No, it's great.
I
I
feel I'm
might
floating away a little bit in
I
terms
might
of
pick up on your tangent because
yeah,
they sort of say in business sometimes like culture eats strategy for breakfast.
yeah.
Um, I don't know, I might bring you in here, Samira. Like, is that true, or actually in a trust's kind of actually more sort of pragmatic than that in terms of focusing on the as you sort of said earlier on, sort of keeping things simple and reducing friction? Like, is culture really
Mm,
important there?
Culture's absolutely essential. It's interesting because we just finished drafting a mergers guidance and we published it. I don't know, was it last week, week before? And in the process of drafting it, I spoke to so many trusts who've been through the joys and the pains of growing and merging. And uniformly, the message that came through loud and clear was that it's all about cultural fit and it's all about the
mm,
people. Because really, it is all about the people, isn't it? And okay, and I think the problem is we often use the
mm,
word culture and then we don't define it. What do we mean by culture?
mm,
So we mean leadership styles, right? Approaches to decision making, the hierarchy versus distributed leadership. That's a cultural question.
mm,
Do people feel empowered and trusted to make decisions? What do staff say about their trusts in surveys, in exit interviews? Really important. How do they go about recruitment? How do they go about developing staff? What's their reputation in the community? Right? That's all culture right there. And so I think it's a word that gets kind of bandied about, but and we have a section in our guidance specifically around cultural due diligence and how you go about identifying what the other trust is really all about. And we give some suggestions of what we've heard from trusts, like get your two teams together, the finance team on one trust and the finance team on the other trust, and get them to meet and just chat. And this is before any merger happens, like you really get at kind of the culture of the trusts when you do that. Talk to the receptionists, the people at the coal face, the people who know the families. Receptionists know everything, especially in primary,
yeah,
right? But it's not just in our sector. We did look at research outside the sector. And so I've got some numbers here. Harvard Business Review identifies cultural mismatch as the key factor in the fact that 70 to 90% of corporate mergers fail. That's a huge number. McKinsey found that companies that manage culture effectively during integration planning are about 50% more likely to meet their objectives. And then KPMG found that mergers that focus on culture are 26% more likely to succeed. It's a very specific number, but that's the one they published. And that if you neglect culture until after the merger, it drastically diminishes success rates. We're talking about decades of mergers and acquisitions that have happened in the private sector. And it always comes back to people and culture. And they have very specific suggestions in the private sector that I actually think apply to us when it comes to leading people through growth and mergers. You want to protect your core talent, right? So one of the biggest risks we run when we grow and we merge is good people will leave. They may not see a place for themselves within the newly formed trust. And so you want to identify those that are really vital to keep and put in place retention strategies for them. And then you want to find those leaders who can bridge culture. So if you're taking on a rural school or if you're taking on CrossFit, different phases, you want leaders who can work across those things and build those bridges across. Communication, can't say enough about that. We've been talking about it consistently, transparently. Change is really hard for people. They get very anxious around growth and mergers. So the more we can communicate, even if it's just to say, hey, just to tell you nothing's changed. We haven't done anything, but just to let you know. And then just being really deliberate about integrating culture. And you do that through things like joint professional development, joint projects, trust-wide forums, right? You're building that kind of collaborative sense of an organization. Back to Matt's point about communication. I don't know why we don't do this. School newsletters. Why do they not have a space reserved for the CEO and a space reserved for the chair of trustees to give those trust-wide messages across all schools? Because parents often don't even know who the trust is. They don't know who the board are. They don't make that connection. But if we make it really visible in the formats that they are already familiar with, like school newsletters, they can see the CEO, they can see the chair of trustees, they can understand that they're actually part of a larger protective structure. They can understand the strategy and the direction of the trust and the role that their school plays in that. So, yeah, sorry, went on a bit there, but it is all about people and culture is the short answer.
That's brilliant. I was going to ask the question that had been asked in the Q&A, but Matt has answered it on the on the text there. So that might have saved me from not managing time well and getting to the end of our time before having much time.
I think just to add to that very quickly is that the trustee advocates that we've got, they link up with the schools. So
Perfect.
It's a really good way. And also we've got our governance family we bring together probably half a dozen times a year, where our trustees are linking with our governors, linking with the school leaders, and they absolutely feel that they're part of the trust family. And we were able to use our links with the West End, and we had a concert for our governors. And we had the most gorgeous concert with our children performing alongside the West End stars, but as a way of thanking our governance family as well. I think we had 318 governors there.
Amazing.
So it's kind of every opportunity to bring those governors together with the trustees, with our members.
Brilliant.
We absolutely looked. They're a very, very important part of our trust.
Brilliant. I wish I didn't have to. I think I'm going to have to bring us to a close. Thanks for that conversation. It's been really interesting. I think it's really great having this mix of sort of sizes of trust and kind of roles together talking about it. We'll follow up for everyone who joined with the recording and with links to materials that have been mentioned and kind of LinkedIn profiles and things like that. I know Sam and Luke and Matt are very happy to kind of collaborate for anyone who wants to get in touch with them personally. We'll include some information on Robin for those of you that aren't yet using it, where you can get a free preview or just follow up on whether you'd like to try Robin out. And as we wrap up, we're just going to do a feedback survey. It'd be great just to get your feedback on how useful this has been and any kind of ideas for future sessions. We'd like to do more of this, bringing people together across the sector and just talking. I find it really interesting, and I think it's so nice to be able to just do it online. So while you're feeling in that feedback, obviously others may just be leaving. So just finally say thanks again to Samira, Luke, and Matt for your time. We really appreciate it, as you showed at the beginning you're very busy people. So it's been really interesting to me, and I'm sure others on the call have really, really enjoyed it too. So thanks, everyone. Hopefully
Yeah,
we'll
it's
see you again.
brilliant. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.